Wyoming Territory, 1872. The dusty streets of Cottonwood Creek stirred beneath the late summer wind, kicking up spirals of golden dirt as the train whistle pierced the afternoon quiet. Matthew O'Brien wiped his brow with the back of his gloved hand, scanning the platform with a knot of unease in his gut. The towering Bighorn Mountains cast long shadows over the valley, their jagged silhouettes a reminder of the unforgiving nature of this frontier. At 25, Matthew had already carved out a life for himself, building a modest cattle ranch from nothing but grit and determination. But the harsh reality of frontier existence had taught him one undeniable truth. In this untamed wilderness, attachment was a luxury no cowboy could afford. "Today's the day, Matt," called Samuel Jenkins, the aging station master, his weathered face creasing with a knowing smile. "Your bride's finally arriving." Matthew adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, concealing the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Just fulfilling a practical arrangement," he replied evenly, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a spooked Mustang. "A ranch needs a woman's touch, that's all." The truth was simpler and far more painful. 3 winters alone in his cabin had nearly broken him. The endless, howling solitude had begun to seep into his bones like the bitter cold. But Matthew had convinced himself this was merely a business transaction, someone to cook, clean, and help with the homestead. Love had no place on the frontier. Love was what got people killed out here, when attachments made you vulnerable and hesitation could cost you everything. His parents had loved each other fiercely, until a Sioux raiding party left him orphaned at 14. His uncle, who'd raised him after, had lost 3 wives, one to childbirth, one to fever, one to a fall from a horse. Each death had carved deeper lines into the man's face until he resembled the craggy landscape itself. No, Matthew had learned early that survival meant self-reliance. Even as he'd penned the advertisement, "Cattle rancher seeks practical woman of good character for marriage of convenience," he'd fortified himself against any foolish notions of romance. The distant rumble grew louder as the locomotive approached, belching black smoke against the vast blue Wyoming sky. Matthew squared his shoulders and adjusted his best shirt, freshly pressed for the occasion. He might not believe in love, but he believed in presenting himself as a man of means and respectability. Inside the train, 20-year-old Dorothea Hayes clutched the worn leather satchel in her lap, her knuckles white with apprehension. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels had been her constant companion for days, but now that the journey was nearly complete, her courage threatened to desert her entirely. The soot-stained letter was folded in her pocket, its crisp, practical wording memorized after countless readings. Matthew O'Brien, cattle rancher, seeking a wife of good moral character and practical disposition. The daughter of a Boston bookkeeper, Dorothea had never imagined herself as a frontier wife. But after the influenza epidemic claimed both her parents last winter, leaving her alone with mounting debts and unwanted advances from her father's employer, the advertisement in the matrimonial news had seemed like divine providence. She'd sold what little she had, purchased a ticket west, and convinced herself that marriage to a stranger was preferable to the alternatives. "Love is a luxury for those who can afford it," she whispered to herself, smoothing the wrinkles from her best blue traveling dress. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, though several tendrils had escaped during the long journey, framing her face in golden wisps. She'd practiced the persona she would adopt: practical, capable, undemanding. She would be the perfect frontier wife, expecting nothing but shelter and respect. Her heart had died alongside her parents. This was merely survival. The train lurched to a stop with a screech of metal against metal. Dorothea took a deep breath, gathered her belongings, and stepped toward the door. She expected nothing from this arrangement beyond security. She had learned through grief that expecting more only invited heartbreak. The moment Dorothea Hayes stepped onto the wooden platform of Cottonwood Creek Station, time seemed to suspend itself. The late afternoon sunlight caught in her honey-blonde hair, creating a halo effect that momentarily stole Matthew's breath. She was younger than he'd expected, her face still bearing the softness of youth despite the determined set of her jaw. Her blue traveling dress, though dusty from the journey, accentuated the slender curve of her waist, and her eyes, a striking shade of hazel, scanned the platform with cautious intelligence. Matthew found himself stepping forward without conscious thought, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that came naturally despite his usual reserve. "Miss Hayes?" he inquired, his voice unexpectedly hoarse. When Dorothea's gaze settled on the young man approaching her, she found herself momentarily stunned. The Matthew O'Brien from her imagination had been older, weathered by frontier hardship. This Matthew stood tall and broad-shouldered, his clean-shaven face bronzed by the sun but unmarked by the deep lines of age. His eyes, startlingly blue against his tanned skin, regarded her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Mr. O'Brien," she responded, extending her gloved hand with practiced composure that belied her inner turmoil. "I am pleased to make your acquaintance." Their hands met, and something electric passed between them, something neither had anticipated nor prepared for. Matthew released her hand quickly, as though burned, while Dorothea busied herself adjusting her bonnet. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" he asked, taking her luggage with awkward formality. "As comfortable as one might expect," she replied, equally stiff. "I am grateful to have arrived safely." An uncomfortable silence fell between them as they stood amid the bustle of the station, each confronting the sudden, unwelcome realization that the practical arrangement they had both envisioned might be complicated by this unexpected physical awareness. "We should proceed to the justice of the peace," Matthew finally said, clearing his throat. "Unless you require rest before." "No," Dorothea interrupted, straightening her shoulders. "I would prefer to honor our agreement promptly. There seems little reason for delay." As they walked side by side down Cottonwood Creek's main street, both fought against the irrational fluttering in their chests. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had both come to this arrangement with clear-eyed pragmatism, not foolish romantic notions. Yet with each step toward the justice of the peace, each felt a growing sense that something unplanned and potentially dangerous was already taking root. The marriage ceremony was brief, clinical, exactly as they had both desired. Justice Williams, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, recited the vows with mechanical efficiency. Matthew placed a simple gold band on Dorothea's finger, and neither met the other's eyes as they spoke their promises. "By the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Justice Williams declared, closing his book with finality. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. O'Brien." Matthew hesitated, then placed the briefest of kisses on Dorothea's cheek, a gesture that should have satisfied propriety without crossing into sentiment. Instead, the touch of his lips against her skin sent a jolt through both of them, leaving them more discomfited than before. "My wagon is outside," Matthew said as they emerged onto the street, now Mrs. and Mr. O'Brien in the eyes of the law. "It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch. We should start if we want to arrive before dark." As Dorothea climbed onto the wagon seat, her new gold band catching the sunlight, she reminded herself firmly of her purpose here. This was survival, not romance. The strange fluttering in her chest when Matthew's hand steadied her was merely nerves, nothing more. Matthew flicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, carrying them away from town and toward the unknown future that awaited them. The vast Wyoming landscape spread before them, beautiful, dangerous, and as unpredictable as the emotions neither was willing to acknowledge. The journey to the O'Brien Ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by Matthew's occasional comments about landmarks they passed. The prairie stretched in golden waves around them, punctuated by the distant silhouettes of grazing cattle. When they crested a final hill, Matthew drew the horses to a stop. "There it is," he said, gesturing toward the valley below. "Not much to look at yet, but it's mine. Ours now, I suppose." Dorothea followed his gaze to where a modest cabin stood beside a large barn. A corral held several horses, and beyond stretched fenced pastureland. It was indeed modest compared to the Boston homes she'd known, but something about the site, perhaps the smoke curling from the chimney or the neat garden plot, stirred an unexpected warmth in her chest. "It looks substantial," she offered carefully. "You've accomplished much on your own." A flash of pride crossed Matthew's features before he masked it. "It's a start. Another few good seasons, and I can expand the herd, maybe build a larger house." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you won't find it too primitive." The vulnerability in his tone caught Dorothea off guard. This was the first crack in his stoic demeanor, and it humanized him in a way that made her heart skip treacherously. I did not come west expecting luxury, Mr. O'Brien, she assured him. I am prepared for frontier life. Matthew, he corrected softly. I suppose you should call me Matthew now. And I am Dorothea, she replied, the intimacy of exchanging first names suddenly making their hasty marriage feel more real than the ceremony had. As they continued down the hill, a rifle shot cracked through the air, sending the horses rearing in panic. Matthew reacted instantly, one arm flinging out to keep Dorothea from being thrown while the other fought to control the team. Get down, he commanded, pushing her below the level of the seat as another shot splintered wood inches from where she'd been sitting. Dorothea's heart pounded as Matthew pulled his own rifle from beneath the seat, scanning the surrounding hills with narrowed eyes. The horses stamped nervously, still harnessed to the wagon. Rustlers, she whispered, surprising herself with her steady voice. Or worse, Matthew muttered. The Hastings gang has been working this area. His expression darkened. I need to get you to safety. When I say run, head for those rocks. He nodded toward a boulder formation 30 yards away. I won't leave you, Dorothea protested, the thought of abandoning him stirring unexpected protectiveness. Matthew's eyes widened at her loyalty, something he clearly hadn't anticipated. Before he could argue, 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them, their faces obscured by bandanas. O'Brien, one called. This is just a greeting. Palmer wants you to reconsider his offer for your water rights. Matthew's jaw clenched. James Palmer can go to hell. That creek is on my property. Another shot kicked up dirt near the wagon wheels. Next time we won't miss. Think about your new wife. The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared over the ridge, leaving an ominous silence in their wake. Matthew exhaled slowly, his knuckles white on the rifle. Are you hurt? He asked, turning to Dorothea with concern that went beyond mere obligation. No, she assured him, though her hands trembled slightly. Who is Palmer? Matthew's expression hardened. Cattle baron who thinks he owns everything from here to Laramie. He's been trying to buy my land for months, specifically the creek that runs through the north pasture. Without it, his herd can't water during dry seasons. And those men, hired guns. Matthew flicked the reins, urging the horses forward with renewed urgency. I'm sorry you've arrived to this. I should have warned you about Palmer in my letters. Would that have changed your offer? Dorothea asked quietly. Matthew glanced at her, conflict evident in his eyes. It should have. No woman should be brought into danger. Yet here I am, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. And I am not so easily frightened, Matthew O'Brien. Something shifted between them in that moment, respect kindling where there had been only awkward formality. Matthew saw not the refined Eastern woman he'd expected, but someone with unexpected courage. Dorothea glimpsed not just the stoic rancher from his letters, but a man defending what was his against overwhelming odds. Both quickly looked away, unsettled by the connection forming despite their mutual determination to keep this arrangement strictly practical. As they approached the cabin, Dorothea noticed a small figure rushing out to meet them, a boy of perhaps 12, wiry and sunbrowned, with a shock of unruly dark hair. You're back, he called, then stopped short at the sight of Dorothea. Is this her? Is this really your wife? Matthew's expression softened. Dorothea, this is Daniel. He helps with the ranch. Daniel, meet Mrs. O'Brien. The title struck Dorothea anew. Mrs. O'Brien. In less than a day, she had traveled across the country, married a stranger, been shot at by outlaws, and acquired a new name. The reality of it all suddenly overwhelmed her. Did you really come all the way from Boston? Daniel asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Do you know how to shoot? Can you make apple pie? Daniel, Matthew chided gently. Let Mrs. O'Brien catch her breath before the interrogation. It's quite all right, Dorothea assured him, finding the boy's enthusiasm oddly comforting after the tension of the journey. Yes to Boston, somewhat to shooting, and most definitely to apple pie, though I'll need apples. Daniel grinned. The widow Simmons has an orchard. I bet she'd trade for eggs. As Matthew helped Dorothea down from the wagon, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist, she caught a glimpse of genuine warmth in his eyes, warmth quickly concealed as he turned to unharness the horses. I've prepared the cabin as best I could, he said over his shoulder, businesslike once more. It's simple but sound. You'll have your own room, of course. The implication was clear. Theirs would remain a marriage of convenience, without the usual intimacies of husband and wife. This was precisely what Dorothea had expected, what she had convinced herself she wanted. Yet as she followed Matthew toward what was now her home, she felt an inexplicable pang of disappointment. "I'll show you everything," Daniel volunteered, taking her satchel and leading her toward the cabin with boyish enthusiasm. "Matt even built new shelves for your things." Dorothea glanced back at Matthew, who was studiously avoiding her gaze as he led the horses to the barn. This was the arrangement they both desired: practical, unemotional, safe. So why did it suddenly feel like something essential was missing? As Dorothea stepped into the cabin that would become her home, she reminded herself firmly, love was a luxury neither of them could afford on this dangerous frontier. They had married for survival, nothing more. Any other feelings were simply the product of nerves and exhaustion. Yet the seed of something unexpected had been planted, taking root despite their determination to remain emotionally distant. Whether it would flourish or wither remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. The life awaiting Dorothea Hayes O'Brien would be nothing like she had imagined. The first weeks of their unconventional marriage settled into an uneasy rhythm. Dorothea threw herself into transforming the Spartan cabin into something resembling a home. She hung the curtains she'd brought from Boston, arranged her few books on Matthew's rough-hewn shelves, and cultivated the small kitchen garden with determined optimism. The physical work was harder than anything she'd known in her previous life, but there was satisfaction in the aching muscles and calloused hands that marked each day's accomplishments. Matthew maintained a careful distance, leaving at dawn to tend the cattle and returning at dusk for the meals Dorothea prepared. Their conversations remained polite but superficial, focusing on practical matters: the condition of the herd, weather predictions, supplies needed from town. Both scrupulously avoided any topic that might venture into personal territory. Only in unguarded moments did their carefully constructed walls show signs of crumbling. Once, Dorothea caught Matthew watching her as she hung laundry, his expression unreadable but intense, until he abruptly turned away when she met his gaze. Another time, Matthew entered the cabin unexpectedly to find Dorothea singing softly to herself as she kneaded bread, her honey-blonde hair escaping its pins, and he'd stood transfixed until she noticed his presence. It was Daniel who served as the unwitting bridge between them. The boy's transparent admiration for Dorothea, especially after she taught him to read from her treasured copy of Robinson Crusoe, seemed to soften something in Matthew's guarded demeanor. He never had much schooling, Matthew explained one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Daniel practice his letters by lantern light inside. It was the first time they had shared this quiet ritual, the cooling night air drawing them together despite their mutual resolve to maintain distance. "How did he come to be with you?" Dorothea ventured, sensing this might be an opening to understand the man she had married. Matthew was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was low, colored by old pain. "Found him 2 years ago during a blizzard. His family's wagon had overturned crossing a river. Parents both drowned. He was half frozen, holding onto a tree branch." Dorothea's hand flew to her mouth. "How terrible. Meant to take him to the orphanage in Laramie come spring," Matthew continued, his profile stern in the fading light. "But by then, well, he fit here. Been with me since." "You saved his life," Dorothea observed softly. Matthew shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she contradicted gently. "Not everyone would have opened their home and heart to an orphan boy." Matthew turned to her then, his blue eyes searching her face as though seeing something he hadn't noticed before. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken recognition. Both had known loss. Both understood loneliness. Without thinking, Dorothea reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his sun-bronzed hand where it rested on the porch railing. The touch, innocent as it was, sent a current through them both. Matthew withdrew his hand as though burned, rising abruptly. "Getting late. Early start tomorrow, moving the herd to summer pasture." Dorothea watched him retreat to the barn, where he had insisted on sleeping despite her private wonderings about this arrangement. Something had shifted between them tonight, some small fissure in the walls they'd constructed, and it left her both unsettled and strangely hopeful. The next morning, Dorothea awoke to raised voices outside the cabin. She dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch to find Matthew in heated conversation with 3 men on horseback. She recognized the middle one immediately from his immaculate suit and silver-tipped cane, James Palmer, whose name was spoken with either reverence or contempt throughout the territory, depending on one's circumstances. "Think on my offer, O'Brien," Palmer was saying, his tone pleasant but his eyes cold as they flicked to Dorothea. "Ah, the new Mrs. O'Brien. My congratulations. I do hope you're finding frontier life accommodating." Dorothea lifted her chin, disliking the predatory assessment in his gaze. "Quite satisfactory, thank you. Such a shame to waste youth and beauty on this struggling operation," Palmer continued smoothly. "My offer stands, O'Brien. $5,000 for the water rights. That would buy your lovely wife some comforts, I imagine." Matthew's jaw tightened. "And leave my cattle without water during summer months." The answer remains no. Palmer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I admire your principles. Truly. But principles don't protect pretty wives on isolated ranches." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Before Matthew could respond, Dorothea moved to stand beside him, her voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Palmer, I believe my husband has made his position clear. Now if you'll excuse us, we have work to attend to." Palmer's eyebrows rose at her boldness. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "As you wish, Mrs. O'Brien. But do remember, I'm a man who gets what he wants, one way or another." As the men rode away, Matthew turned to her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You shouldn't have provoked him. I merely stated facts," Dorothea replied, though her heart was racing. "Was I wrong to stand with my husband?" The word husband lingered between them, highlighting the strange intimacy of their situation, legally bound yet emotionally distant. "No," Matthew finally said, his expression softening. "You weren't wrong. But Palmer is dangerous. He's driven 3 other ranchers off their land this year alone." "Then we must be vigilant," Dorothea said simply. Matthew studied her face, seeing determination where he'd expected fear. "You're not what I expected, Dorothea Hayes O'Brien." She allowed herself a small smile. "Nor you, Matthew O'Brien." The moment stretched between them, interrupted when Daniel came running from the barn, oblivious to the tension. "Are we still moving the herd today? Can Dorothea come too?" Matthew hesitated, clearly torn between keeping Dorothea safely at the cabin and leaving her alone after Palmer's visit. "It's hard work," he cautioned. "I didn't come west expecting leisure," she reminded him, echoing her words from their first day. "I can ride, and I'd rather be with," she caught herself before saying "with you. With both of you than alone here." Something in Matthew's expression shifted, a wall lowering slightly. "Very well, but stay close." The day that followed transformed their tentative connection. Dorothea surprised Matthew with her determination, helping drive the cattle alongside Daniel, while Matthew led the way to higher pastures. When a summer thunderstorm broke overhead, drenching them all, Dorothea laughed instead of complained, her wet dress clinging to her slender frame in a way that made Matthew avert his eyes with gentlemanly restraint. They took shelter in an abandoned line shack, where Matthew built a fire while Dorothea wrung water from her hair. Daniel fell asleep almost immediately, curled by the hearth like a puppy, leaving the adults in rare private conversation. "Where did a Boston bookkeeper's daughter learn to ride like that?" Matthew asked, passing her a cup of coffee from his saddlebag supplies. Dorothea accepted it gratefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "My mother's brother owned a small stable. I spent summers with them before he lost everything gambling." She hesitated, then added softly, "There's much about me you don't know." "I'm beginning to see that," Matthew acknowledged, his voice equally quiet. After a pause, he continued, "I should have asked more in my letters. About you, your hopes." "As should I," Dorothea admitted. "We were both focused on practicalities." "Is that wrong?" Matthew asked, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "To marry for practical reasons?" Dorothea considered this, warming her hands on the tin cup. "My parents married for love," she finally said. "When father died, mother followed within a week. Of grief, the doctor said. I swore I would never make myself so vulnerable." Matthew's expression shifted in recognition. "My uncle raised me after my parents were killed. He'd lost 3 wives. Used to say, 'Love is a luxury no one survives out here.' A sentiment we shared in our correspondence," Dorothea noted. "Yet here we are, Matthew said softly. The implication hung between them, that perhaps their careful arrangement was becoming something neither had anticipated or prepared for. Here we are, Dorothea echoed, meeting his gaze across the small space, the storm raging outside, while something equally powerful stirred within. Matthew broke the tension first, rising to check on the horses. When he returned, their conversation turned to safer topics: the quality of the summer grass, plans for harvest, Daniel's improving reading. But something had changed. Questions had been asked that couldn't be unasked, feelings acknowledged that couldn't be unfelt. As the weeks passed, the invisible barrier between them continued to erode. Dorothea began accompanying Matthew and Daniel more frequently, learning the rhythms of ranch life. Matthew found himself lingering over breakfast, sharing stories of his parents he'd never told anyone. Small touches became more frequent, a hand steadying her as she mounted her horse, fingers brushing as they passed dishes at dinner, shoulders touching as they sat on the porch watching summer sunsets. Yet neither was ready to name the growing feeling between them, each still clinging to the belief that emotional attachment was a dangerous luxury on the frontier. Their marriage remained unconsummated, though the air between them grew increasingly charged with unspoken desire. It was an early August evening when the fragile peace of their arrangement was shattered. Dorothea had walked to the creek to gather wild raspberries, planning to surprise Matthew with a pie for his birthday, a date she discovered from Daniel's innocent chatter. The boy had wanted to accompany her, but had chores to complete first. She was kneeling by the water, basket half filled with berries, when she heard horses approaching. Looking up, she froze at the sight of 3 riders, the same men who had shot at the wagon on her arrival. Before she could run, they surrounded her. "Well, what have we here?" the leader drawled, his face partially covered by a bandana. "Mrs. O'Brien, all alone. Palmer will be interested to hear this." "My husband is expecting me," Dorothea said firmly, though fear coursed through her veins. "He'll come looking if I'm delayed." The man dismounted, approaching her with predatory confidence. "Then we shouldn't delay. Palmer just wants to talk. Convince your stubborn husband to sell before someone gets hurt." "I will convey your message," Dorothea replied, backing away. "Now please leave our property." "Oh, we'll leave," the man agreed, reaching for her arm. "But you're coming with us, as insurance." What happened next was instinct more than thought. As the man grabbed her, Dorothea swung the basket of berries, striking him full in the face. He staggered back, cursing, and Dorothea seized the moment to run. A gunshot cracked, the bullet splintering a tree trunk inches from her head. "Next one won't miss," the leader shouted. "Stop or die." Dorothea froze, calculating her chances. The creek lay between her and home. Even if she screamed, the cabin was too far for Matthew to hear. A second shot rang out, but this one came from the trees behind her. The leader's hat flew from his head, and he ducked reflexively. "Touch her, and the next one goes between your eyes." Matthew's voice rang out, deadly calm. He emerged from the tree line, rifle aimed steadily, Daniel a few paces behind him with a smaller gun. The leader spat. 3 against 3, O'Brien. Sure you want to risk your wife and boy?" 4 against 3, corrected a new voice as Sheriff Taylor stepped from the opposite bank, his own weapon trained on the riders. "Palmer's getting careless, sending you in broad daylight. Drop your weapons, boys." A tense standoff followed, broken when the leader finally lowered his gun. "This ain't over, O'Brien. Palmer wants that water. One way or another, he'll get it." "Not today," Sheriff Taylor said firmly. "Now, you're coming with me to jail until Judge Harris arrives next week." As the sheriff led the sullen men away, Matthew rushed to Dorothea, his composed facade crumbling as he grasped her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" "When Daniel said you'd gone to the creek alone, I'm unharmed," she assured him, though she trembled with delayed shock. "How did you know?" "Daniel overheard Palmer's men in town yesterday," Matthew explained, his hands still gripping her arms as though afraid she might disappear. "They were planning something. When we couldn't find you." His voice broke, revealing the depth of emotion he'd been concealing. Without thinking, Dorothea reached up, her palm against his cheek. "I'm safe. You found me in time." Matthew covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press his lips against her palm in a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. For a breathless moment, the pretense of their practical arrangement fell away completely. I thought I might lose you, he confessed hoarsely. And I realized, Dorothea? Are you really okay? Daniel interrupted, rushing forward to hug her tightly. The spell broken, Matthew stepped back, his expression closing once more as he retrieved his rifle. We should return to the cabin. It'll be dark soon. As they walked home, Daniel chattered excitedly about their rescue mission, but Dorothea barely heard him. Something fundamental had shifted during those moments by the creek. Matthew had looked at her with more than concern for a practical partnership. He had looked at her with the raw fear of a man confronting the possibility of losing someone precious. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Dorothea found Matthew on the porch, staring into the darkness. She joined him silently, their shoulders not quite touching as they leaned against the railing. Sheriff Taylor will keep them locked up through the judge's circuit, Matthew finally said. But Palmer won't stop. Not until he gets what he wants. Or until someone stands against him, Dorothea suggested quietly. Matthew turned to study her face in the moonlight. This isn't the life you signed up for, he said softly. Danger. Threats. You deserve better. I signed up to be your wife, Dorothea replied, meeting his gaze steadily. In whatever that entails. A marriage of convenience, Matthew reminded her, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Is that still what this is? Dorothea asked, her heart pounding as she dared to voice the question that had been growing between them for weeks. Matthew's breath caught. Before he could answer, a rider appeared in the distance, approaching fast. The moment shattered as Matthew reached for his rifle, positioned once more between Dorothea and potential danger. But it was only a neighbor, bringing urgent news. Palmer's men had broken free during transport to the jail in Laramie, killing a deputy in the process. They were now wanted men, with nothing to lose. Sheriffs forming a posse at dawn, the rider informed them. Says Palmer's gone too far this time. Governor's been telegraphed. After the neighbor departed, the earlier intimacy between Matthew and Dorothea had been replaced by practical concerns, securing the cabin, checking ammunition, planning for Daniel's safety. Their almost confession remained unspoken as more pressing matters demanded attention. I'll ride with the posse, Matthew decided, loading his rifle. You and Daniel will stay with Widow Simmons in town until this is resolved. And if it's never resolved? Dorothea challenged, surprising herself with her boldness. Will we live our lives in fear of Palmer? Always separated when danger threatens? Matthew stared at her, conflict evident in his eyes. What would you have me do? Risk your safety? I would have you trust me to stand beside you, Dorothea said quietly. Not shield me from the reality of our life together. Our life together, Matthew repeated, the words holding weight neither had acknowledged before. He set down the rifle, crossing to where she stood with unexpected determination. His hands cradled her face with exquisite gentleness. Dorothea, I need to tell you. A gunshot shattered the window behind them, sending glass spraying across the cabin floor. Matthew instinctively covered Dorothea with his body, dragging her down as more shots followed. Palmer's men, he shouted, pushing her toward the bedroom where Daniel slept. Get the boy. There's a trapdoor under the bed, root cellar. Go. Heart racing, Dorothea ran to wake Daniel, while Matthew returned fire through the broken window. She could hear horses circling the cabin, men shouting threats as bullets splintered wood. They've fired the barn, Daniel cried, peering through a small window as Dorothea pulled at the trapdoor. Flames illuminated the night, casting an orange glow through the windows. The horses screamed in terror, and Dorothea made a split-second decision. Matthew, she called. The horses. He appeared in the doorway, face streaked with sweat and soot. Get below. Now, we can't leave them to burn, she insisted, knowing what the animals meant to their livelihood. And to Matthew, who treated each with affection he rarely showed humans. Indecision wore on his face before he nodded sharply. Stay low. When I create a diversion, run for the barn. Free the horses, then straight to the root cellar. No heroics. Dorothea nodded, heart pounding but resolve firm. This was their home, their life. She wouldn't hide while it burned. The next few minutes passed in a blur of smoke and gunfire. Matthew provided covering fire while Dorothea and Daniel raced to the barn, throwing open stalls to release panicked horses. The roof was already engulfed, timbers creaking ominously as they worked. That's the last one, Daniel shouted over the roar of flames. Come on. They ran for the cabin, bullets kicking up dirt around their feet. Daniel reached the door first, but as Dorothea followed, white-hot pain exploded in her side. She stumbled, falling to her knees with a cry of surprise more than pain. "Dorothea!" Matthew's voice seemed to come from far away. Strong arms lifted her, carrying her into the cabin as darkness edged her vision. The last thing she remembered was Matthew's face above her, raw anguish replacing his usual stoicism, and his voice, broken, desperate, saying words she'd longed to hear but never expected. "Don't leave me, Dorothea. I love you. God help me, I love you." Then darkness claimed her completely. Dorothea drifted through layers of consciousness, catching fragments of reality before sinking back into oblivion. Matthew's voice, hoarse with exhaustion, reading from her Bible. Daniel's tearful pleas for her to wake up. The cool touch of a cloth against her forehead. Pain, sharp and insistent, whenever she tried to move. When she finally opened her eyes fully, sunlight was streaming through unfamiliar curtains. She lay in a comfortable bed that wasn't her own, bandages wrapped tightly around her torso. Attempting to sit up proved impossible, sending daggers of pain through her side. "Easy now," came a gentle female voice. An older woman with kind eyes appeared beside the bed. "That bullet took a fair piece of flesh with it. You'll need time to mend." "Matthew? Daniel?" Dorothea asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The boy's fine, not a scratch on him." "Your husband?" The woman, whom Dorothea now recognized as Doc Wilson's wife, hesitated. "He's with the posse. They rode out 3 days ago, after Palmer's men." 3 days? Dorothea echoed, struggling to process this information. "I've been unconscious for 3 days." "Fever took hold," Mrs. Wilson explained, offering a cup of water. "Infection. We weren't sure." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. "Your husband refused to leave your side until yesterday, when word came that they'd tracked Palmer to his ranch. Sheriff insisted they needed every man." Dorothea closed her eyes, memories flooding back. The attack, the barn burning, Matthew's face as he carried her, and his desperate words, "I love you." Had she imagined them in her delirium? He was quite fierce in his devotion, Mrs. Wilson continued, a knowing smile touching her lips. "Slept on the floor beside your bed, held your hand through the worst of the fever. Not exactly the behavior of a man in a marriage of convenience, if you don't mind my saying." Heat that had nothing to do with fever flooded Dorothea's cheeks. Our arrangement is complicated. Love often is, especially out here." The older woman agreed sagely. "Now rest. Your body needs to heal." But rest proved impossible as hours stretched into days with no word from the posse. Daniel visited daily, bringing wildflowers and reporting on the condition of the homestead. The barn would need rebuilding, but neighbors had already salvaged usable timber and offered temporary shelter for the livestock. "Matt made me promise to stay in town until he returns," Daniel explained, his young face serious. "He said nothing matters except that you get better." 5 days after Matthew had ridden out, Dorothea was strong enough to sit on the doctor's porch, wrapped in blankets despite the summer heat. Her mind replayed those last moments before she was shot, examining Matthew's actions, his words, searching for confirmation that what she'd heard in her semi-conscious state had been real. The practical arrangement they'd both agreed to had evolved into something neither had anticipated, something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. If he returned, when he returned, she corrected firmly. What then? Would they acknowledge the feelings that had grown between them, or retreat once more behind the safety of their original agreement? It was dusk when riders appeared on the outskirts of town, a group of perhaps 15 men moving slowly through the gathering shadows. Dorothea strained to see, heart pounding painfully against her ribs as she searched for Matthew's familiar silhouette. The town erupted into activity as the posse approached. People poured from homes and businesses, eager for news. Dorothea tried to stand but found herself too weak, frustration bringing tears to her eyes as the riders disappeared from her view behind other buildings. Minutes that felt like hours passed before she heard his voice calling her name. Matthew appeared at the edge of the porch, hat in hand, face haggard with exhaustion and several days' growth of beard darkening his jaw. He stood frozen, staring at her as though unable to believe she was really there. "You're alive," he breathed, the simple statement containing a universe of emotion. "As are you." she replied, her voice catching. Neither seemed to know what to say next, the weight of unacknowledged feelings creating a barrier between them. It was Daniel who broke the impasse, bursting onto the porch with excited questions about the posse's success. "Palmer's finished," Matthew confirmed, his eyes never leaving Dorothea's face. "The governor sent troops from Fort Laramie. He's being transported to Cheyenne for trial, federal charges." "And his men?" Dorothea asked quietly. Something dark crossed Matthew's features. "Two dead. 3 captured. They won't threaten anyone again." The implications settled heavily. Matthew had been part of deadly violence, perhaps taken life himself in this pursuit of justice. Instead of revulsion, Dorothea felt only relief that he had returned to her. "Daniel," she said gently, "would you ask Mrs. Wilson for some fresh water? Mr. O'Brien looks like he could use refreshment." Understanding the request for privacy, Daniel nodded and disappeared inside. When they were alone, Matthew crossed the porch in 2 strides, kneeling beside Dorothea's chair. His hands, calloused and dirt-stained, hovered near hers but didn't quite touch. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I heard you," Dorothea admitted softly. "When I was shot." "What you said." Color touched Matthew's cheeks, but he didn't look away. "I meant it," he said simply. "Though I never meant to love you. It wasn't part of our arrangement. Nor did I intend to love you," Dorothea confessed, her heart pounding at the admission. "Yet here we are." "Here we are," Matthew echoed, finally taking her hands in his. The touch broke whatever remaining restraint held them apart. Matthew leaned forward, his lips finding hers in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened, years of loneliness and weeks of growing affection culminating in this moment of connection. When they finally parted, both breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I never believed in love, not out here. Thought it was a weakness a man couldn't afford." "And now?" Dorothea asked, her fingers tracing the contours of his face as if to memorize every detail. "Now I know it's the only thing worth fighting for," he answered, his blue eyes clear with newfound certainty. "You and Daniel, you're my family. My home." "Even though loving makes us vulnerable?" she asked, giving voice to the fear that had held them both back for so long. "Especially because of that," Matthew said firmly. "These past days, riding with the posse, all I could think was that if you died believing our marriage was merely convenient, I'd never forgive myself. Life out here is uncertain, Dorothea. The only thing I'm sure of is that I want to spend whatever time we have truly together, as husband and wife in every sense." Tears welled in Dorothea's eyes. "I want that too." Their second kiss sealed a promise that went beyond their original practical arrangement, a commitment born of choice rather than necessity, of love rather than convenience. "Does this mean you'll sleep in the house now?" Daniel's voice interrupted them, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and delight as he stood in the doorway with a pitcher of water. Matthew laughed, the sound startling in its unfamiliarity but warming Dorothea's heart. "Yes, young man, it does. If Mrs. O'Brien will have me." "I will," Dorothea assured him, her smile radiant despite her weakened state. "Though I believe I was promised a larger house eventually." "Anything you want," Matthew vowed, his thumb caressing her knuckles. "Anything at all." 2 years later, Dorothea stood on the porch of their new home, larger than the original cabin, but still modest by Eastern standards, exactly as she preferred. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach, evidence of the child that would join their family come winter. Behind her, Matthew and Daniel worked together, installing glass windows that had been ordered all the way from Denver. The O'Brien Ranch had prospered since Palmer's downfall. With the threat removed, Matthew had expanded his herd and acquired additional grazing land. Dorothea had started a small school for neighboring children, putting her Boston education to use in a way she found deeply fulfilling. Their marriage, begun as a practical arrangement between strangers, had blossomed into a partnership of equals bound by deep love and mutual respect. The false beliefs that had shaped their initial expectations, that love was a dangerous luxury on the frontier, that emotional attachment led only to pain, had been replaced by the truth that sharing life's hardships made them more bearable, that joy multiplied when experienced together. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across their property, Matthew appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. O'Brien?" Dorothea leaned into his embrace, considering the journey that had brought them here. "I was thinking about the day I stepped off that train," she admitted. "How terrified I was, yet determined not to show it. How I had convinced myself that a marriage without love was safer." Matthew chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And I was equally determined to keep things strictly business between us." "We were quite foolish," Dorothea observed, turning in his arms to face him. "Stubborn," Matthew corrected, his blue eyes warm with affection as his hand moved to rest protectively over hers on her belly. "But we figured it out eventually." Daniel joined them, now 14 and nearly as tall as Matthew, proudly carrying the letter that had arrived that morning. Official notice that his adoption had been finalized, making him legally Daniel O'Brien. As the family stood together watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant hues, Dorothea reflected that the frontier remained as challenging and unpredictable as ever. Drought threatened crops, harsh winters claimed livestock, illness and accident lurked as constant possibilities. Yet facing these realities together had proven far superior to facing them alone, protected by emotional walls but deprived of love's comfort. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train expecting nothing more than shelter and security had found something infinitely more precious. A family bound not by convenience but by choice, a love that had transformed a house into a home, and the certainty that whatever hardships the frontier might bring, they would face them together, hearts racing in unison, just as they had on that first unexpected day.